Nevaeh Buchanan was born on February 4th, 2004. According to those who knew her, she was a bright, energetic child who loved life. She had recently graduated from the Discovery Preschool program at Cantrick School and was eagerly anticipating starting kindergarten in the fall of 2009. She was fascinated by motorcycles and enjoyed the sound and look of them. She loved driving her Power Wheels Escalade around the apartment complex and riding her scooter. Her family would say that she rode around thinking she was hot stuff. The child lived with her mother Jennifer and her maternal grandmother Sherry at the Charlotte Arms apartment complex in Monroe. Nevaeh's biological father was Shane Hinojosa from Toledo, Ohio. According to reports, there had been a custody dispute between Shane and Jennifer that created tension and separation. Shane stated that because of this ongoing dispute, he had not seen his daughter for years before her disappearance, which caused him extreme anguish. The evening of Sunday, May 24th, 2009, Memorial Day weekend, began like any ordinary day. The timeline of Nevaeh's disappearance has some discrepancies that would later become important to the investigation and would raise questions about the events leading up to her disappearance. According to official reports and Jennifer Buchanan's statements to police, Nevaeh was last seen playing outside in the parking lot of their apartment complex at approximately 6:30 p.m. She was riding her scooter wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt with red and white horizontal stripes. Jennifer later stated that after noticing her daughter's scooter in the parking lot, but not seeing Nevaeh herself, she began searching the apartment complex grounds and the nearby area. However, there are conflicting accounts about the timeline that would later trouble investigators. While Jennifer initially told reporters and journalist Nancy Grace that her daughter had been gone for only about 30 minutes before she started looking for her, later reports indicated that she didn't actually begin searching until closer to 8 p.m. This would mean Nevaeh may have been missing for up to an hour and a half before anyone noticed her absence, a significant gap that investigators would scrutinize and that remains unexplained to this day. This issue has never been fully clarified, though it undoubtedly influenced part of the investigators' examination of the family's actions that evening. The search began immediately after Jennifer contacted authorities. In addition to ground searches, dogs and helicopters scoured the nearby area. The helicopters would continue flying for several days in a desperate effort to locate any trace of the missing child, but failed to find anything of worth. Then the next day, around 12:30 a.m., a Michigan Amber Alert was issued. At that time, Michigan Amber Alerts were faxed to radio and television stations through a list maintained by the Michigan State Police. Others could receive the alerts by subscribing to a cell phone text alert service. By the late 2000s, it was said that the vast majority of children in the program were ultimately found alive and safe. This fact brought along hope that Nevaeh would soon be found. The community response to Nevaeh's disappearance was immediate and overwhelming. The case quickly escalated from a local missing child report to a major investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies and drawing national media attention. On May 25, 2009, just over 24 hours after Nevaeh vanished, two registered offenders, George Kennedy and Roy Lee Smith, were taken into custody for violating their probations. Both men were friends of Jennifer Buchanan, a fact that immediately raised red flags among investigators and would become central to early investigative efforts. By May 26th, hundreds of community members gathered to organize search parties. These volunteers joined professional search teams in combing large parts of Monroe County for any sign of the missing girl. On May 27th, police divers searched two additional quarries in Monroe, and Jennifer was questioned for hours by investigators. By the next day, tips to police had reached 500. Approximately 100 federal, state, and local police officers were now involved in the investigation. At least 240 people at the Charlotte Arms apartment complex had been interviewed by police. Every single one of the 180 units in the apartment complex had been searched by law enforcement. Students at Airport High School even wore yellow shirts and hung yellow ribbons on their lockers in a student-led effort to show support and draw additional attention to the situation. On the 29th, DNA testing was completed on blood found on property owned by George Kennedy. The results failed to match Nevaeh's DNA, though this did not eliminate Kennedy as a person of interest in the investigation. 2 days later, a third person of interest emerged. James Easter, aged 64, was picked up for questioning after investigators learned he had visited the apartment complex. More significantly, after being interrogated by police, Easter went home and immediately built a fire in his backyard where he burned items. This suspicious behavior led authorities to arrest him on charges of arson and preparing to burn property. He was held in Monroe County Jail on a $250 bond. However, he was never charged in connection with the disappearance and was later released, leaving questions about what he had been burning and why. On the morning of June 4th, 11 days after the disappearance, the worst fears of the family and the community were realized in a horrifying discovery. Guy Bickley, aged 51, along with his son Ryan, was fishing along the banks of the River Raisin near Dixon Road in Raisinville Township, approximately 7 miles from where Nevaeh had last been seen. According to Guy Bickley's account to media outlets, he was using what he thought was a block of concrete as a footrest while fishing. He noticed a foul odor emanating from the area and was swarmed by flies. As the Bickleys continued fishing, they realized something was terribly wrong. Upon closer inspection, they discovered what appeared to be a small body encased in what looked like concrete or fast-drying cement powder. The area was immediately cordoned off, and a massive forensic investigation began, which yielded various pieces of evidence from the shallow grave. Shortly after the discovery, DNA evidence from the crime scene confirmed that the body was indeed the girl they have been searching for. Over a month later, the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office released autopsy results that revealed the most disturbing aspect of this already tragic case. The findings indicated that Nevaeh died of asphyxiation and was most likely buried alive. According to Sheriff Tillman Crutchfield, the autopsy showed that the girl had inhaled dirt or soil into her lungs, which caused her death. As previously mentioned, one of the initial persons of interest was a man named George Kennedy. He was a registered offender and a friend of Jennifer's. The two had met through their parole officers approximately 2 years before the incident, which raised immediate questions about how such a relationship could have developed and why Jennifer would maintain contact with someone with Kennedy's criminal history. His extensive criminal record often involved minors. This included incidents in 1998 and 2002, just to name a couple. However, in 2003, Kennedy was released from prison in a plea deal. Despite knowing Kennedy was a sex offender, Jennifer maintained a friendship with him. She defended this relationship to the media, stating that, quote, "Everyone deserves a second chance." This decision would later come under intense scrutiny from both investigators and the public, who questioned whether adequate protective measures were in place for those at risk. Back on May 25th, just 1 day after our victim went missing, Kennedy was arrested for violating his parole by being near a child. He was staying at a motel located less than 3 miles from the Buchanan's apartment complex, putting him in very close proximity to where Nevaeh disappeared. When police searched Kennedy's motel room and van, they discovered deeply disturbing evidence that shocked investigators. They found bloody towels, shorts covered in blood, and blood on the bathroom wall. A blood-stained knife and other sharp-edged tools were discovered, along with photographs of young girls and children's toys. Human hairs were also found in the room. All of this evidence was sent to the laboratory for analysis, and investigators watched anxiously for results that might connect Kennedy to the crime. However, as mentioned, DNA testing showed that Nevaeh's DNA did not match the blood found on Kennedy's belongings. Kennedy was never charged in connection with Nevaeh's murder. However, he remained in prison on the parole violations stemming from his contact with Nevaeh and her family. As of 2010, Kennedy was described as serving out his original sentence. Another person of interest was a man named Roy Lee Smith. He was 48 at the time, and like Kennedy, Smith was a registered offender and a friend of Jennifer. His criminal history was even more extensive and troubling than Kennedy's. Smith had served 15 years in prison for multiple criminal misconduct convictions before being released in 2008, less than a year before the disappearance. This meant he had been out of prison for less than 12 months when nevaeh vanished, raising questions about whether adequate monitoring was in place. Smith had met Jennifer Buchanan through George Kennedy, further connecting the web of relationships around Jennifer that placed known offenders in close proximity to her daughter. In interviews with media outlets, Jennifer admitted she, quote, had a feeling Smith was a offender but allowed him around nevaeh anyway. This admission further fueled public criticism of Jennifer's judgment and parenting decisions. The question of why she would knowingly allow multiple convicted offenders to have access to her daughter became a point of intense public scrutiny. When questioned by police, Smith claimed he had an alibi involving his girlfriend's mother's car. However, investigators found discrepancies in his story that raised red flags and caused them to maintain Smith as a person of interest in the investigation. Like Kennedy, Smith was arrested on probation violations shortly after nevaeh's disappearance. He too was never charged with murder but remained imprisoned on the probation violations. Sherry Buchanan, nevaeh's grandmother and legal guardian, maintained that she believed George Kennedy and Smith were involved in the incident, though she acknowledged she couldn't say for certain. Throughout the investigation, police pursued numerous other leads that consumed resources and investigator hours. They questioned an ice cream truck driver who had been in the area searching for any possible connection to nevaeh. On June 2nd, 2009, police announced they were searching for two vans, one green and one silver, that had been seen near Hollywood Elementary School, now known as Arborwood North Elementary. Authorities wanted to speak with the drivers of these vehicles to determine if they had any information. On May 31st, 2009, authorities announced they wanted to talk to the driver of a minivan that had been seen in the area around the time of the disappearance. And perhaps the most significant and frustrating development in the case came in May 2014, 5 years after the murder. According to multiple reports, several investigators told nevaeh's family that they believed they knew who killed her, providing a ray of hope that justice might finally be approaching. Risa Smith, vice president of the Justice for Nevaeh organization and a paternal relative of nevaeh's, revealed what investigators had told the family. The suspect was reportedly not any of the original persons of interest named early in the investigation. According to the family, the suspect was in prison on an unrelated felony charge by 2014 and was expected to remain imprisoned for at least a decade on that unrelated charge. This meant that even if investigators couldn't prove his involvement in nevaeh's murder at that time, at least he was incarcerated and posed no further danger to the community. One investigator reportedly told the family they were 99% sure about who committed the crime. This high level of confidence suggested that investigators had substantial evidence or information pointing to this individual. However, despite this confidence, investigators admitted they didn't have enough to charge this individual with the murder. This created a frustrating situation where someone they believed was almost certainly guilty remained uncharged while the family waited for justice. The family's reaction to this revelation was one of profound frustration and anger. The years of waiting without answers, combined with this revelation that authorities believed they knew who did it but couldn't prove it, created an agonizing situation for the family. Additionally, they felt that investigators were withholding information that could potentially help them gather additional evidence from the community. Some argued that since the suspect was already locked up, it was already sufficient justice. However, the family greatly disagreed as this suspect was serving time for an entirely different crime while escaping accountability for nevaeh's murder. When CBS Detroit contacted police for comment on these allegations in 2014, authorities did not immediately respond to inquiries. Investigators confirmed that they had received several tips over the years, but stated they still needed a breakthrough in the case to charge anyone with murder. They described it as an ongoing open investigation that remained very much active despite the passage of 5 years at that point. In 2021, Sheriff Troy Goodenough took significant steps to reinvigorate the investigation. He commissioned a new team of investigators from the Sheriff's Office Detective Bureau who partnered with special agents from the FBI's Ann Arbor office. This new team was tasked with reviewing all investigative material from the original investigation, re-interviewing witnesses, and utilizing cutting-edge forensic technology to develop new leads. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office also established a cold case homicide unit in partnership with the FBI, University of Michigan Dearborn, and University of Toledo. Despite the frustrations and lack of an arrest, law enforcement officials have remained publicly committed to solving the case. Officials describe the case as an active investigation, not a cold case. Investigators remain tight-lipped about specific evidence and developments, which some interpret as a sign they have information they don't want the killer to know about or information that might compromise an ongoing investigation. The lead detective continues to investigate, and new forensic techniques continue to be applied to evidence collected in 2009. In 2025, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office website maintains information about the Cold Case Homicide Unit and its commitment to solving historical murders, stating that, quote, "No criminal should find solace in the passage of time." The Italian Unabomber refers to a case that took place between August 1994 and May 2006. An unidentified individual terrorized the northeastern regions of Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia with a series of bombings that injured more than 30 people but claimed no lives. Obviously, the moniker was inspired by the infamous American serial bomber Theodore Kaczynski, though the two cases differ fundamentally in methodology, motivation, and outcome. Unlike Kaczynski, the Italian bomber struck randomly, concealing explosive devices within everyday consumer products and leaving them in public spaces where unsuspecting victims, frequently children, would discover them. The bomber never claimed responsibility, issued no demands, articulated no ideology, and left investigators grasping at theories for nearly 3 decades. The bombing campaign concentrated overwhelmingly in a specific geographic corridor of northeastern Italy. The municipalities most frequently targeted included Pordenone, Portogruaro, and surrounding towns in the provinces of Pordenone, Venice, and Treviso. This clustering led investigators to theorize that the perpetrator likely resided or worked in western Friuli, particularly in or near Pordenone. The temporal pattern of attacks proved equally distinctive. The campaign began on August 21, 1994, with a crude pipe bomb detonated at a bird festival in Sacile attended by approximately 50,000 people, resulting in minor injuries to 4 individuals from scattered debris. After a series of attacks in 1994, 1995, and 1996, the bomber inexplicably ceased activity between 1997 and 1999. This hiatus has generated extensive speculation among investigators, with theories ranging from incarceration for an unrelated crime, mandatory military service, personal crisis, or relocation. The bombings resumed in July 2000 and continued with increasing frequency and sophistication until the final confirmed attack on May 6, 2006. Since that date, nearly 2 decades of silence have elapsed. Throughout his spree, the culprit used a variety of inconspicuous devices to carry out his deeds. This included food products such as Nutella jars, tubes of mayonnaise, Kinder Surprise eggs, and more. In July 2002, bomb disposal technicians defused a device hidden inside a Nutella jar at the Iperstanda supermarket in Portia. Then in November of the same year, a woman in Cordignano lost her thumb and 2 fingers when she handled a booby-trap tube of tomato paste in her own kitchen. Other items that were used included pens, soap bottles, toy eggs, and markers. These particular items were specifically used to target children, potentially revealing a grudge against them in particular. These are just a few of the objects that the bomber used. The technical sophistication of the devices evolved dramatically over the campaign's 12-year span. Early devices consisted of simple explosives that could be constructed by anyone with basic chemistry knowledge. However, later devices incorporated nitroglycerin, a highly unstable and dangerous explosive that requires advanced chemistry expertise to synthesize safely. One Reddit discussion by chemistry enthusiasts analyzing the case, emphasized the extreme danger of producing nitroglycerin at home, noting that any temperature deviation could potentially cause an immediate explosion. The fact that the bomber successfully produced and handled this substance suggested exceptional chemical expertise through professional training. Furthermore, the devices themselves were designed specifically to maim rather than kill. They employed electronic triggering mechanisms in later iterations and were calibrated to cause severe localized injuries to hands, arms, faces, and eyes at short range while minimizing lethality. This deliberate limitation distinguished the culprit from typical terrorists, leading investigators to classify them not as a serial killer nor as a conventional terrorist, but rather as a unique category of criminal motivated by obscure psychological factors. The first victim to sustain serious injury was an elderly woman named Anna Pignat, who triggered a booby trap resulting in amputation of her arm in September of 1995. Then in November 2001, a 63-year-old unnamed woman was injured when a votive candle exploded at a cemetery. The same day, another woman suffered serious injuries to her left hand when a bomb concealed inside a tube of tomato sauce detonated at the Continent supermarket in Portugal. In 2002, a child injured themselves while opening a soap bottle, and the previously mentioned woman interacting with a tomato paste tube lost several fingers. In April of 2003, during a family picnic, 2 girls were injured when they handled a tampered marker. One 9-year-old lost 3 fingers and suffered severe eye injuries, losing sight in one eye. Then an additional 3 children sustained injuries in March of 2005 when one attempted to light an electrical candle during Mass at church. As for the final confirmed attack, which occurred on May 6, 2006, a 28-year-old man was walking with his girlfriend when he discovered a bottle wedged between rocks that contained a message. Upon opening the bottle, an explosive detonated, severing his thumb and damaging 2 other fingers, with further wounds to his chest and neck. His girlfriend suffered eardrum damage and cuts from the flying glass. The Italian government eventually granted compensation to several victims, with varying amounts as low as 40,000 euros to over 190,000. The investigation into the bomber became one of Italy's most intensive and prolonged criminal investigations, involving coordination between local police forces, the paramilitary police, regional prosecutors, and the FBI. The most promising forensic breakthrough occurred in November 2002 when a man reported to police that an egg he had purchased at a local market had been tampered with. Upon examination, investigators discovered a hair and traces of saliva on adhesive tape affixed to the egg box, from which they successfully extracted a DNA sample. This DNA evidence would become central to the investigation and its eventual 2022 reopening. Additionally, another recovered device yielded a fingerprint, though it was insufficient for definitive identification. A task force developed a comprehensive psychological profile and suggested that the culprit was a male aged 40 to 50 who lived alone and possessed chemistry and engineering knowledge. This could possibly be due to a military or industrial defense background. It's also possible that the individual suffers from some sort of psychological trauma or impairment. On August 28, 2006, Italian police executed a raid on the residence of Elvo Zornita, a 49-year-old engineer from Azzano Decimo near Pordenone, who had been under surveillance for approximately 1 year with FBI assistance. Elvo became the investigation's primary suspect based on a mix of circumstantial evidence that initially appeared compelling. He possessed the technical expertise to construct sophisticated explosive devices, having worked for a major Italian defense contractor specializing in weapon systems. He maintained what newspapers described as a home workshop or type of laboratory in his attic where he engaged in various personal projects. During searches of Elvo's residence, investigators discovered several items they considered incriminating. These included empty containers of the same novelty eggs that were used in the attacks, felt-tip pens similar to those used in the bombs, firecrackers in various stages of completion, and most significantly, a pair of scissors. On October 10, 2006, investigators announced that they had found compelling forensic evidence linking Elvo to at least one attack. Forensic experts claimed that the blades of scissors seized from his home matched cut patterns on tin sheeting that had wrapped an explosive device discovered by a cleaning woman at a church in 2004. This bomb had been found before detonation and safely defused. 3 separate forensic tests allegedly confirmed the scissors match, and investigators compiled a 500-page dossier of evidence. Elvo's work-related travel and movements also showed correlation with certain bombing dates and locations, suggesting he had the opportunity to plant devices. Additionally, some investigative reports mentioned suspicion that Elvo had a slight impairment that matched up with the hypothetical profiles from detectives, though the nature of this impairment was never clearly specified. His younger brother Giuseppe was also initially considered a suspect, partly due to similar reasoning. However, bombings continued while Elvo was under active surveillance for 2 years. Investigators confirmed that he had solid alibis for at least 2 attacks, with Chief Prosecutor Vittorio Borrichetti stating definitively in 2011 that Elvo was not involved in those incidents. This led to speculation about accomplices, with suspicion briefly extending to Elvo's wife and brother, though DNA testing of these relatives returned negative results. Despite the evidentiary problems, Elvo was formally charged with planting 20 of the bombs. He was required to appear in court in Trieste on October 10, 2006, to begin preliminary trial proceedings. However, the case against Elvo collapsed spectacularly when his defense attorney Maurizio Pani challenged the scissors evidence that formed the prosecution's cornerstone. On January 17, 2007, Maurizio presented a theory saying that the cut marks on the tin sheeting had been made after police seized the scissors, potentially by investigators themselves to strengthen an otherwise weak case. Further forensic testing supported this theory, revealing that Ezio Zernar, a ballistic technician working in the scientific unit of Venice investigators, had tampered with the evidence to make it appear more incriminating. Zernar subsequently became the subject of a separate criminal investigation for evidence fabrication. With the scissors evidence discredited and no other physical evidence directly linking Elvo to the bombings, prosecutors requested dismissal of the case. In January 2009, after years of investigation, surveillance, public scrutiny, and legal proceedings, Elvo was acquitted. He received 300,000 euros in compensation for his wrongful arrest and trial involving fabricated evidence. Elvo maintained his innocence throughout, explaining that the scissors were just an ordinary pair, and the other suspicious items, such as the pens, simply belonged to his 10-year-old daughter. Following his acquittal, Elvo reportedly stated that if he ever discovered the person truly responsible for the crimes he had been accused of, he would strangle him. After more than 16 years of silence and dormancy, the Italian Unabomber case was officially reopened in October 2022 at the request of a journalist and a victim. The reopening was predicated on significant advances in DNA analysis technology that allowed examination of biological traces using techniques unavailable during the original investigation. The 2022 investigation involved more than 2 years of additional genetic testing by forensic specialists. However, by October 2025, these tests had ruled out any connection between the DNA of 11 suspects and the biological material retrieved from the explosive devices. With no new evidence emerging, the investigation appeared to be approaching definitive closure. This outcome left victims and their families profoundly disappointed and embittered, many having suffered lifelong injuries, disfigurement, and psychological trauma without resolution. The only person ever convicted in connection with the case remained the police officer accused of manipulating evidence to frame Elvo. The dahlsjo case took place on July 29, 1965, and involved 4 young men who vanished from Gothenburg, Sweden under unexplained circumstances. 3 dock workers aged 21, 22, and 16, respectively named Jan-Olof Dahlsjo, Gay Carlson, and Kjell-Åke Johansson, disappeared after leaving Cafe Martin in a midnight blue 1956 Volvo PV444, while an 18-year-old art student named Hubner Einar Lundqvist vanished the same day while traveling through the city. Neither the men nor the vehicle has ever been recovered, making this Sweden's only unsolved mass disappearance and a case that continues to confound investigators. The three young men who vanished from the cafe shared working-class backgrounds and employment in Gothenburg's industrial and maritime sectors. Jan resided in the Haga district of Gothenburg with his mother Ingrid and his two younger brothers, with two older brothers also living nearby. He worked for a maintenance company and was described as loyal to his friends and family, though he had minor run-ins with law enforcement, as was common among young working-class men in the area. He was particularly close with Gay Carlson, and the two were considered inseparable friends. Carlson lived in a rundown apartment block in Gothenburg. In 1965, he experienced legal troubles, having been arrested for drunk driving and burglary during the summer. Despite these brushes with the law, Carlson maintained employment and close relationships with his family. As for Johansson, despite his age, he had recently become a father, a detail that strongly suggests he was unlikely to have voluntarily abandoned his family. He worked for a company providing surface treatments, and his father was employed at the same firm. Just weeks before his disappearance, he had been arrested for public drunkenness. All three men were known to carry surprisingly large amounts of cash at times, though the source of this money has never been definitively explained. They had reputations as reliable workers who occasionally engaged in minor criminal activity, but nothing that suggested involvement in serious or organized crime. The precise activities of the three men in the 24 to 48 hours before their disappearance remain partially undocumented, though investigators and family members were able to piece together a fragmentary timeline. On the morning of July 28th, Jan left his home for what would be the last time. His mother, Ingrid, later reported that he was dressed in a brown suit, light blue socks, and black shoes, and that he had taken an extra pair of light-colored trousers with him. Before departing, Jan told his mother he was planning to go camping and swimming with friends in Asa, a village approximately 45 kilometers south of Gothenburg. Significantly, he left behind both his passport and his seafarer's discharge book, a crucial document for anyone working in Sweden's maritime industry. He also had an uncollected salary waiting for him at his place of employment, which his mother later had to retrieve. He also worked a full shift on July 28th, but did not return home after work concluded. At approximately 2 a.m. on July 29th, Jan and Carlson appeared at the home of a mutual friend in the Olskroken suburb of Gothenburg. The purpose of this visit was described as simply saying goodbye to their friend. This detail would be a point of interest amongst investigators as they questioned why the two young men would visit a friend at such a time, specifically to say goodbye, unless they knew they had a dangerous journey ahead of them. At roughly 6:30 a.m., Carlson arrived at the Swedish Public Employment Service office in the Masthugget district. He remained there until approximately 8 a.m. when he and a group of other men went outside to smoke. While outside, a driver of a red truck offered Carlson temporary work for the remainder of the morning and most of the afternoon. This is one of the last confirmed sightings of him before he appeared at the cafe. That same morning, Johansson left his family's apartment but left his work shoes in the hallway, a detail that baffled his mother. He brought approximately 100 Swedish kroner with him. Like Jan, Johansson also told his mother he would be going camping in Asa. Johansson did not report to work that day, and what he did instead remains unknown. The three men congregated at the cafe in the Haga district at some point shortly after noon. The cafe was located at Landsvagsgatan 24, at the corner with Frigångsgatan. It is not known what they ordered or discussed while there, though witnesses would later confirm they were present. At approximately 3 p.m., in what would become the last confirmed sighting of the trio, Johansson, Carlson, and Jan left the cafe, entered the Volvo, and drove away. Notably, Carlson was seated in the driver's seat, despite the fact that none of the three men possessed a valid driver's license. The vehicle was registered to Jan's older brother, Bengt, though Jan is believed to have been the primary user of the vehicle. It was after the three got inside the car that they were never seen again. This missing vehicle would become as much a part of this mystery as the missing men. The 1956 Volvo was painted in a distinctive shade described as midnight blue, though it is often referred to as dove blue in Swedish media coverage. The disappearance of the Volvo is significant because it suggests several possibilities. The car could have ended up in water, been hidden or deliberately destroyed, been driven to a remote location and abandoned, or been involved in an accident in a location not yet discovered. As mentioned, both Jan and Johansson told their mothers they intended to go camping and swimming. However, several facts cast doubt on whether the location they shared was their genuine destination. The weather on July 29, 1965 was particularly poor, being rainy, cold, and entirely unsuitable for camping or swimming. Investigators noted that the group's departure at 3 p.m. was relatively late in the day to begin a camping trip. Furthermore, neither the Volvo nor any trace of the men was ever discovered along the route between Gothenburg and Asa, despite extensive searches of roads, waterways, and coastal areas. This has led investigators and researchers to question whether Asa was ever the true destination, or whether the men used the camping story as a cover for other plans. Curiously, the families of Jan and Carlson delayed reporting the men missing. This delay meant that authorities did not immediately recognize the three disappearances as potentially connected. All three men were reported missing at different times, and it took months before police could confirm they had vanished simultaneously. The reasons for the delay are not entirely clear, though several factors may have contributed. Young men in 1960 Sweden, particularly those from working-class backgrounds with histories of minor legal trouble, were not always expected to maintain regular contact with family. It was not uncommon for young men to leave for days at a time for work or leisure. Additionally, if the families believed the men had genuinely gone camping, they may not have been immediately concerned about a lack of communication. Johansson's new status as a father, however, made his failure to return home particularly alarming to his family. Another key individual in this case was an art student who also went missing, named Hubner Lundqvist. At 18 years old, he was the son of Evert Lundqvist, one of Sweden's most celebrated painters and graphic artists. Evert was awarded the prestigious Prince Eugen Medal for painting in 1961 and served as a professor at the Royal Swedish Academy of Arts from 1960 to 1970. Hubner's mother was also an accomplished artist named Ebba Reuter Krona. For most of July 1965, Hubner spent time with his family at their summer residence in Torekov, a coastal town in Scania in southern Sweden. However, he grew restless and uncomfortable staying with his overprotective parents. He had read about an art colony in Lysekil, a town on Sweden's west coast north of Gothenburg, and decided he wanted to visit during his summer vacation. On the afternoon of July 29, 1965, Hubner left his family's summer home. The exact time of his departure is disputed. Some sources indicate he left around 3 p.m., coincidentally, the same time the trio departed the cafe, while others suggest he left later in the afternoon. At the time of his departure, he was dressed in a brown suede leather jacket, white cotton shirt, gray polyester pants, and a dark blue sweatshirt. Like Jan and Johansson, Hubner did not bring his passport, but he carried the same amount of Swedish kroner with him as Johansson. The method of Hubner's travel to Gothenburg is uncertain. Some sources claim he hitchhiked the entire distance, while others state he made it to a point in the middle where he purchased a train ticket to Gothenburg Central Station. Regardless of the method, he arrived at Gothenburg Central Station at approximately 8 p.m. on July 29th. The final confirmed trace of Hubner came in the form of a postcard he mailed to his parents from Gothenburg Central Station. The postcard said, "All is well, don't worry." In the card, he indicated he was planning to hitchhike the rest of the way from Gothenburg to Lysekil. This journey would have been approximately 130 kilometers north along the coast. This postcard represents the last verified contact anyone had with Hubner. The most persistent theory regarding his disappearance is that he hitchhiked with the trio and shared their fate, whatever that may have been. This theory is based on several factors. The coincidence of Hubner being in Gothenburg on the same day the three dock workers vanished, the geographic proximity given that Gothenburg Central Station is not far from the Haga district, where the trio was last seen, the fact that Hubner was seeking a ride north and may have encountered the three men in their Volvo, and the possibility that their route could have overlapped with his intended direction. However, no physical evidence has ever been found linking him to the 3 dock workers. There are no witnesses who saw him with the trio, no indication that their paths crossed, and no forensic or documentary evidence connecting the cases beyond the coincidence of date and location. Unlike the trio, whose disappearances were quickly accepted as likely involving foul play or accidental death, Hubner's parents maintained for years that their son had left Sweden to work on the high seas. This belief was reinforced by alleged sightings reported by Swedish sailors. 2 sailors reported encounters with a young man matching Hubner's description. One claimed to have spoken with a young man resembling Hubner in Adelaide, Australia in 1966, approximately 1 year after his disappearance, and another reported a similar encounter in Singapore in 1968, approximately 3 years after he vanished. These sightings have never been confirmed or substantiated. No photographs, documentation, or follow-up contacts ever materialized. The encounters remain tantalizing but ultimately unverifiable anecdotes. If the sightings were accurate, it would mean Hubner voluntarily disappeared and spent years traveling internationally without contacting his family, a scenario many find implausible given his young age, his close relationship with his parents, and the lack of any apparent motive for such a drastic action. Another intriguing aspect tying to this case is an incident referred to as the Frogman robbery, which also occurred on July 29, 1965 in Gothenburg. At approximately 2 p.m., 2 armed men stormed the Scandinavian Bank in the Gamlestaden district of Gothenburg. One of the robbers was dressed as a woman as a disguise. The men brandished submachine guns and fired volleys into the ceiling to intimidate customers and staff. The robbery quickly spiraled into chaos. A bank customer who happened to be a professional wrestler tackled one of the robbers to the ground. During the struggle, the robber accidentally shot himself in the leg. Despite the injury and the disruption, the robbers managed to flee the bank with a sum of 18,000 Swedish kroner. Bank employees pursued the fleeing robbers to see where they would go. What happened next transformed the robbery from a bungled heist into a bizarre spectacle. The robbers scrambled down to the nearby river and began stripping away their outer clothing. Underneath their clothing, they wore complete scuba diving gear. The escape plan was evidently to dive into the river and swim downstream to a boat waiting for them at a predetermined location. The escape, however, was thwarted. Bank employees continued their pursuit, throwing rocks at the robbers. The robbers responded by firing back with their guns, forcing the pursuers to retreat. The robber who had shot himself in the leg was unable to continue the escape due to his wound. He remained stationary underwater in the murky river for several hours, hindered by his injury, while his accomplice slipped away with the money. Both robbers and a third accomplice were eventually apprehended by Swedish police. All 3 men were Hungarian citizens who had fled to Sweden following the 1956 Hungarian Revolution and were convicted and imprisoned for the crime. The occurrence of 3 highly unusual events, 2 disappearances, and an elaborate bank robbery in the same city on the same day has naturally led to speculation about a connection. Some researchers have suggested that the trio may have been local accomplices in the Frogman robbery, providing assistance, local knowledge, or transportation. According to this theory, the camping trip was a cover story and the men were actually involved in the planning or execution of the heist. After the robbery went wrong, the theory suggests the men fled or were eliminated by the Hungarian criminals to prevent them from talking. However, several factors argue strongly against this theory. The Hungarian robbers were described as heavily involved in organized crime, while the dock workers had only minor criminal records for petty offenses. No evidence has ever emerged linking the dock workers to the robbery. Swedish police have officially discredited this theory. Additionally, the timeline is problematic. The robbery occurred around 2 p.m., while the trio was last seen leaving the cafe at 3 p.m. They would have been visible and documented if they were present at the robbery scene. Another variant suggests the dock workers may have witnessed something related to the robbery or its planning, and were eliminated to ensure their silence. However, no evidence supports this theory either. The most likely explanation, and the one accepted by Swedish authorities, is that the robbery and the disappearances are entirely coincidental. While the convergence of events on a single day in 1960 Sweden was highly unusual and created an atmosphere of mystery and speculation, no credible evidence has ever linked the three robbers to the four missing men. Swedish authorities conducted extensive searches of bodies of water in and around Gothenburg. The searches included dragging operations in rivers and lakes, examination of coastal waters along the Kattegat Strait, and exploration of areas where a vehicle could have left the road and entered water. None of these searches yielded any trace of the men, the Volvo, or any evidence of an accident. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence emerged sometime in August 1965, when Gay Carlson's sister went to her brother's apartment to look for clues about his whereabouts. When she knocked on the door, a young stranger opened it. The man was wearing a knitted sweater that she had personally made for her brother. The stranger appeared visibly distressed. He told Carlson's sister to look for her brother in the pub district of Haga. The sister found the encounter deeply unsettling, but did not immediately report it to authorities or pursue the matter. Decades later, she came forward with a startling claim. She believed the man wearing the sweater was actually Johansson, the 16-year-old who had vanished with her brother. If accurate, this identification would suggest that Johansson survived whatever happened to the other two men, at least initially. He returned to Carlson's apartment for unknown reasons and was involved in or knowledgeable about what happened to his friends. However, this identification came many years after the fact, and memories can be unreliable over such time spans. Additionally, if Johansson was alive and in Gothenburg in August 1965, why would he disappear again? Why would he be wearing Carlson's clothing? And why did he direct Carlson's sister to search the pubs rather than providing concrete information? The most widely accepted theory is that the three men and possibly Hubner were involved in a fatal car accident. Investigators pointed to the poor weather on July 29th and the young age of the group as potential factors that support this. But as mentioned several times, no trace of the Volvo that they were driving was ever found. Some investigators and researchers have suggested the men may have been involved in criminal activity that resulted in their deaths. All three men occasionally carried large amounts of cash, had minor criminal records, and the sweater incident suggests someone may have returned to Carlson's apartment, possibly searching for something or retrieving belongings. Challenges with this theory include the fact that there is no evidence of serious criminal involvement beyond minor offenses. No criminal organizations or individuals have been linked to the disappearances. The men's families and employers describe them as reliable and loyal. The complete absence of bodies, evidence, or confessions over 60 years is highly unusual. The case remains officially unsolved and is classified as a cold case by Swedish officials. And after 60 years, the likelihood of ever solving it has greatly diminished. Any potential witnesses have died or their memories have faded. If the men died in an accident, natural processes may have scattered or completely decomposed remains. Anyone with direct knowledge of what happened would now be in their 80s or older.